Beach FM, locals talking to locals.
Time to welcome into the studio this morning, not the Mayor, not the Deputy Mayor, but Chair of the Finance Committee, is Michael Scott. Morning, Michael.
Good morning, Nigel.
Welcome in.
Thank you on this beautiful Kapiti Day.
You haven't got your mayoral chains on yet?
No, I think if I pinched those out of Guru's office, he might think there was a coup d'etat about to take place.
Fair enough. Now, the High Court has made their decision much earlier than what the Mayor mentioned last week. He was expecting some sort of result by the end of this month. Yeah, gosh, we're in December already, Michael. He said towards the end of December, but it has been resolved and Kapiti Coast District Council has been vindicated.
Yes, the crew, the Coastal Ratepayers Group, had piggybacked on some proceedings taken initially by a group in Otaki. When we settled with the group in Otaki, crew kept these ones going. They went through the Environment Court and then the decisions which were reached in the Environment Court were appealed by crew. Mr Justice Collins has dismissed both of crew's concerns. The first one, that they wouldn't be involved along with community groups in the development of coastal hazards, and said that fear was just illusory. And secondly, that having brought their concerns to the Environment Court and had them dealt with, it was difficult to see what more crew wanted. So look, the answer is that for many years, crew's been fighting with council. They've been spectacularly unsuccessful at it. So what we're saying is, why don't you take a different tack? Why don't you become part of the advisory group that Council's setting up, along with many other key stakeholders, including DOC, including Forest and Bird, including the local dunes restoration groups. Why don't you become part of that and work with Council? You get a lot more with collaboration. So we've written to crew twice now. We're going to set up this committee and it's going to have some meetings. We're going to work hard at trying to find some solutions within what is a national discussion. So there are two messages, I think, Nigel. Firstly, there's a national discussion to be held. It's not going to be run by the Kapiti Coast District Council on behalf of the country. We're not resourced to do that. That's a central government issue, and indeed the High Court indicated that doing it carefully, doing it once and doing it well was a far more acceptable solution than rushing in, as Council did in 2012 with the hazard lines and getting it horribly wrong. And secondly, that the hand is open and the seat is available for crew round the table, but they're going to have to walk through the door and be part of it.
There's about 2,800 homes were affected by this, weren't there, or something like that?
1,800 homes had a notice put on their LIM report, a setback line. Now, at the time, many of us said, you've got it wrong. This is not the way you do it. You consult first. Right. You tell people what the issue is, and you talk it through. What you don't do is put the line on first and tell people, tough luck.
Right. So that was the Chief Executive's decision, was it, at the time?
No, that was a staff and council decision, right. That was going to happen, and many of us were concerned about it at the time. I was chairing the community board in Waikanae at the time, and we were faced with a similar issue. That was a walkway through the sandhills in front of people's houses. So what we did was, instead of telling people that we're going to do it and see what you think once it's built, we told people about it, and we entered into a consultation phase, and guess what? It was unpopular, so it didn't happen. We needed to get the science right, and there currently isn't a lot of good science on the setback stuff. Right. Interesting, you see, the government has already raised the seawater level. It used to be 1 metre, we're now talking about 1.5 metres and things like that. So until they've got their own central policy statements in order, which not only territorial authorities like KCDC want, but regional councils as well. Greater Wellington Regional can't really move on its strategies until it knows what central government's strategy is.
So the lines that are, or the information that's contained in the LIM reports now, that stays, does it?
No, the setback lines were taken off. Yep. So that though an artificial line drawn to say that by some period in the future you could be having breakfast in the sea is no longer there, and we start again. We start to try and find some good science based on central government policy, and we start a conversation with our community. And that's what's important for Crew to be part of. They bring some expertise and they bring some knowledge. And you know what? They bring some passion, and that's always useful.
So now the council can sort of revise its fit-for-purpose coastal hazards assessments.
Yes, so now we've got our PDP, which is working through its appeal period. It will become operative at the end of that period, especially if there are no appeals. We start working with it. There'll be plan changes and things that will happen in the life of that. One of them will, of course, be the outcomes in Waikanae Beach, which will ultimately become a plan change to take into account some of those special character features. But in the meantime, Council's now got an opportunity, as it always said it would in its evidence to both the Environment Court and the High Court, to sit down with all of the local interest groups and start talking about what coastal hazards might look like in the future.
So the value of properties haven't been too much affected by this?
So they went up massively recently in the last valuation. This current valuation, coastal properties didn't go up as much as the average across the district.
That's understandable though, isn't it? I mean, you're next to the coast. It's talked about now.
So it is something that's talked about, and it is something that's thought about. And for example, if you look at the subdivisions in Te Horo, south of the township, you don't get building in the sandhills anymore. There's a setback area because there's a clear acknowledgement that something's going to happen. It's a natural process.
Right. So somebody's got to pay for the High Court's decision. Who pays for that? Council, or is it the CRU?
Crew will pay costs. Costs have been reserved in favour of council, and they in the High Court are on a formula. So my expectation is a little more than $15,000 will be paid to council, and then there's still costs in the Environment Court to come. You can waste a lot of money on this sort of thing. I'd frankly rather spend it on consultation.
Fair enough too. All right, so that's been resolved. Wastewater. Now, you tell me that the Kapiti Coast District Council has got one of the best wastewater outcomes ever.
Look, our wastewater treatment plant is in the top few in terms of the country. We're starting our long-term plan briefings, so it was interesting to talk about the fact that we're only about half of its capacity. Our discharges are only about half of what we could actually discharge once the water's been treated. But what was also interesting, and what an extraordinary job our staff do in terms of taking the nitrates and potassium and those other things out of the water before we release it. Now, of course, we release ultimately to a drain. Some areas release to land, but of course it all ends up in a waterway one way or the other. But it was interesting for councillors to hear just what a good job that wastewater treatment plant actually does, and that there's plenty of life left in it and there's plenty of capacity. You know, that's one of the reasons why we put the added rising main from Waikanae through to the wastewater treatment plant whilst the expressway was being built. You know, that was key work done by the chief executive and by the group manager, Mr. Mallon, to bring that project forward and do it at a time the expressway was being built rather than try and lay a pipe later. And it was sensible, it was cost effective, and it just built that extra bit of capacity in for Waikanae.
So that's all that work that was done at Rangiora Street, was it?
No, that was to provide us with a bit of a surge chamber and a bit of capacity. There was only about 5 hours capacity in the Waikanae wastewater treatment plant or wastewater treatment system if we couldn't pipe to Paraparaumu. And that meant that after 5 hours it has the potential to start bubbling back in low-lying properties, and you really don't want a gift that keeps returning. So that we did two things. Firstly, we created a surge chamber and some pumping stuff at the end of Rangiora Road there, and now, of course, the rising main to assist in pumping it. more of it down to Paraparam if we need to.
So you say we've got the capacity to cover what we've got going on at the moment, population boom and housing boom.
Absolutely. So we're discharging about half of what we're allowed to in terms of our resource consent. And we're now looking towards reconsenting that plant in the future. So there's all sorts of monitoring work to be done and discussions to be had on water quality and discussions with our community. There's iwi discussions to be had about the discharge, but there's nothing surer that everybody still needs to go to the toilet, and at the end of the day, it doesn't matter who you are and where you live, you still want to push the button and see it all disappear.
Absolutely. Now, we've only got a couple of days to go before the end of the PDP submissions, is that right?
No, we've only got a couple of days before you can go to Valuation New Zealand and say,
that's what I'm thinking of, yes.
And say, gosh, my valuation's far too low, please review it.
Right. Or it's too high.
It's an interesting dilemma because, of course, lots of people are talking to me saying, gosh, my property went up 40% and therefore my rates are going to go up 40%. And I have to firstly take them by the arm and say, well, firstly, just breathe through your nose, because that's not the case. And I don't know where you got this advice from, but
I'll be listening to Auckland, you see.
Well,
that's a different situation.
Yes, that's the happy Jaffers, and we should leave them to what their information is, because it's just plain wrong. The answer is that if your property value has gone up by more than the average across the district, then you may well have a slight increase in your rates due to that valuation increase. But absolutely and utterly, if your property went up 40% in value, your rates are not going to go up 40%.
What are we looking at next year? 5%?
So we're working really hard to be around the former LTP figure, somewhere between 4.5 and 5. We've begun a rates review, and the signal to staff is that there are several areas that we'd like to reform. We'd like to get rid of uniform charges. And we'd like to make those more targeted in terms of use and land value. So that's going to be useful, I think. It's going to mean a much fairer rating system. Currently, 51% of our rates is collected by fixed charges. And fixed charges are a very, very blunt way of getting money out of people's pockets. What we'd like to do is get to an even third. So about at least that's my kind of figure I'd like to see as Chairman of Operations and Finance. I think if we had a third from land value, if we had a third from capital value, and if we had a third from fixed charges, I think we can get a much fairer system. Currently we've got 18 different mechanisms for rates, Nigel, and I think we just need to spend a bit of time simplifying that.
Michael Scott, we thank you very much for your time this morning and standing in for the Mayor and Deputy Mayor today.
106.3 Beach FM.